Chosen one, this message is finding you on purpose. Not by accident. Not by timing. Not by algorithm. It is reaching you by divine confirmation, arriving at the exact moment when your spirit can finally receive what your mind has been trying to rationalize away. There has been a knowing inside you that never left, no matter how hard you tried to quiet it. A pressure in your chest. A weight in your thoughts. A subtle alarm in your soul that refused to turn off. You felt it when the energy shifted without explanation. You felt it when voices changed tone, when warmth turned cold, when familiarity suddenly felt distant and unsafe. That wasn't imagination. That wasn't sensitivity. That was perception. What your spirit has been screaming about was real. Every gut feeling that made no logical sense but felt undeniable. Every sleepless night where your body stayed alert even when your mind was exhausted. Every moment you replayed conversations wondering what you missed, what changed, what you did wrong. You didn't do anything wrong. You were responding to something unseen, something intentionally hidden, something moving behind your back while you were being encouraged to doubt yourself. The confusion was manufactured. The silence was strategic. The distance was deliberate. Someone believed they could bury the truth deep enough that it would never surface. They mistook your patience for ignorance. They mistook your silence for weakness. They assumed that if they controlled the narrative long enough, reality itself would bend around their lies. But truth doesn't stay buried. Truth has weight. Truth has gravity. And no matter how much pressure is applied to suppress it, it always pushes upward until the ground above it cracks. You are standing at the edge of that fracture now. The moment where everything that was concealed begins to rise. The moment where whispers become evidence. The moment where what felt like intuition transforms into confirmation. Forces far beyond human planning have begun rearranging the board. Conversations you were never meant to hear are surfacing. Patterns you were told were coincidence are aligning too perfectly to deny. What was once fragmented is coming together with frightening clarity. Tonight marks a turning point. Not symbolically. Not emotionally. Literally. What was done behind your back is coming to light in the physical world, not just the spiritual one. Actions taken in secrecy are being pulled into visibility. Decisions made in shadows are being examined under unforgiving scrutiny. Records are being reviewed. Timelines are being reconstructed. Witnesses are remembering details they were encouraged to forget. The structure that protected wrongdoing is destabilizing, piece by piece. And there is a consequence attached to this exposure. Not karma in some abstract sense. Not poetic justice. Real accountability. Legal accountability. Physical consequence. Someone who believed they were untouchable is about to learn how fragile their protection truly was. Someone who thought manipulation erased responsibility is about to face the weight of what they orchestrated. Someone is going to prison, not because of revenge, but because balance demands correction when harm crosses a certain threshold. You were never meant to fight this battle yourself. That's why every attempt to force resolution left you drained. That's why confrontation never felt right. That's why silence, though painful, was necessary. You were being moved out of the line of fire while forces beyond you handled what you were never supposed to carry. Your role was survival. Your role was endurance. Your role was staying aligned while everything unseen positioned itself for exposure. This moment is not about vindication for ego. It is about restoration of truth. It is about the end of a cycle where deception thrived because light was underestimated. You did not imagine the threat. You sensed it because you were meant to outlive it. And now, as the ground begins to shift and the buried begins to breathe again, you are being told this so you can stop questioning yourself. So you can stop replaying the past. So you can finally understand that what you endured was not random, and what is coming next is not accidental. The truth is rising. The silence is breaking. And the chapter that tried to destroy you is closing under the weight of its own lies. Chosen one, you weren't paranoid. You weren't imagining things. You weren't too sensitive, broken, or unstable. You were aware. You were perceiving shifts that others either couldn't see or pretended not to notice. Every time you felt watched without being seen, every moment you sensed a presence in the background of your life, you were responding to something real. You were under observation, not in a dramatic sense, but in a calculated one. Your movements were noted. Your reactions were studied. Your words were weighed and stored. You were being measured, assessed, and monitored by people who believed they had the right to analyze you without your consent. The whispers you felt weren't imagined. Conversations were happening about you in rooms you weren't in, with tones that changed the moment you entered. Information about your life traveled faster than it should have, reaching people you never told. The strange delays weren't bad timing. Opportunities didn't stall by chance. Emails didn't go unanswered accidentally. Processes didn't suddenly slow down without cause. Hands were quietly placed on timelines, applying pressure, creating friction, introducing obstacles designed to frustrate and exhaust you. The doors that closed without explanation weren't slammed by fate. They were shut intentionally, often with a smile, often with false concern, often while assuring you it had nothing to do with you. The people who suddenly switched sides didn't wake up one day and change their hearts. Influence was applied. Narratives were seeded. Doubt was introduced slowly, carefully, so it felt organic. You watched familiarity turn into distance, loyalty dissolve into neutrality, support become silence. You could feel the shift, even when no one admitted it. That feeling of being tolerated instead of welcomed, questioned instead of trusted, evaluated instead of understood, was not accidental. It was the result of coordination. This wasn't chaos. It was strategy. Pieces were moved while you were distracted by surviving. Roles were assigned. Some were told what to say. Others were told what not to say. Silence was weaponized just as effectively as slander. The goal wasn't just to block you. It was to confuse you, to make you doubt your instincts, to keep you searching inward for faults that were never there. They wanted you looking at yourself while they operated around you. And now the universe has aligned this moment because that structure cannot hold anymore. The lies they told about you are collapsing all at once, not slowly, not quietly, but in overlapping waves. Stories that once stood uncontested are being questioned. Timelines are no longer matching up. People are comparing notes, noticing gaps, sensing inconsistencies they once ignored. What felt solid is showing cracks, and those cracks are spreading faster than anyone can control. What they tried to hide is being exposed from multiple directions simultaneously. Not from a single source they can silence, but from angles they never anticipated. One truth triggers another. One revelation unlocks the next. Evidence appears where there was once only suspicion. Memory sharpens where there was once confusion. Even those who benefited from believing the lies are being forced to confront what they helped uphold. You sensed it because you were meant to outlive it. And now, as the ground begins to shift and the buried begins to breathe again, you are being told this so you can stop questioning yourself. So you can stop replaying the past. So you can finally understand that what you endured was not random, and what is coming next is not accidental. The truth is rising. The silence is breaking. And the chapter that tried to destroy you is closing under the weight of its own lies. Chosen one, you weren't paranoid. You weren't imagining things. You weren't too sensitive, broken, or unstable. You were aware. You were perceiving shifts that others either couldn't see or pretended not to notice. Every time you felt watched without being seen, every moment you sensed a presence in the background of your life, you were responding to something real. You were under observation, not in a dramatic sense, but in a calculated one. Your movements were noted. Your reactions were studied. Your words were weighed and stored. You were being measured, assessed, and monitored by people who believed they had the right to analyze you without your consent. The whispers you felt weren't imagined. Conversations were happening about you in rooms you weren't in, with tones that changed the moment you entered. Information about your life traveled faster than it should have, reaching people you never told. The strange delays weren't bad timing. Opportunities didn't stall by chance. Emails didn't go unanswered accidentally. Processes didn't suddenly slow down without cause. Hands were quietly placed on timelines, applying pressure, creating friction, introducing obstacles designed to frustrate and exhaust you. The doors that closed without explanation weren't slammed by fate. They were shut intentionally, often with a smile, often with false concern, often while assuring you it had nothing to do with you. The people who suddenly switched sides didn't wake up one day and change their hearts. Your boundaries were tested. Your strengths were measured not to be honored, but to be neutralized. They smiled in your face, mirrored your values, echoed your language, all while quietly designing a path meant to destabilize you over time. What felt like closeness was access. What felt like trust was exposure. They presented themselves as your ally while laying groundwork for your isolation. They positioned themselves as essential so that when the damage began, you would hesitate to question them. Their strategy relied on your humanity, on your tendency to give the benefit of the doubt, on your belief that intelligence and charm must equal integrity. They assumed your light made you naive. They assumed your depth made you predictable. They were wrong on both counts. What you didn't know then is that you weren't their first target. Their confidence didn't come from brilliance alone. It came from experience. They had done this before. They were part of a system, not a lone operator, a structure that has hunted chosen ones across time. A pattern of identifying those with rare perception, those whose presence shifts environments, those whose existence threatens fragile power structures. This wasn't personal in the way you might think. It was predatory. They sought light the way parasites seek hosts. Others came before you. Others who sensed something was wrong but didn't have the protection you carry. Their stories never surfaced because their destruction was thorough. Their reputations were dismantled. Their connections severed. Their voices discredited. Some lost their purpose. Some lost their sanity. Some lost their lives in ways that never made the news, never sparked investigations, never triggered justice. Their light was extinguished quietly, efficiently, without witnesses willing to speak. That history fed the mastermind's certainty. They believed the system worked. They believed the outcome was inevitable. They believed you would follow the same trajectory as those before you. They watched for signs of collapse. They waited for you to break. They planned for your disappearance from relevance, from influence, from clarity. They assumed you would be next. They were wrong. They miscalculated the source of your strength. They underestimated the protection surrounding you, the lineage behind you, the forces that move when you are threatened. They thought intelligence alone could outmaneuver destiny. They thought experience made them untouchable. But they didn't account for one thing they could never study or steal: your alignment. Your resilience. Your refusal, even in confusion, to fully surrender your inner knowing. That single miscalculation changed everything. Then came the seducer, introduced not as a threat but as an answer. The one assigned to bind you emotionally, to reach you where logic couldn't protect you. Their role was not force but intimacy. Not attack but attachment. They were meant to enter your life softly, wrapped in familiarity, disguised as love or as a deep, rare friendship that felt destined. They didn't rush. They understood timing. They knew that to trap someone like you, they had to make it feel chosen, mutual, sacred. They studied your desires with patience. They learned what you longed for when you were honest and what you settled for when you were tired. They paid attention to the wounds you never spoke about directly, the disappointments that shaped your caution, the moments where you almost gave up on being truly seen. They noticed how deeply you crave authenticity, how you respond to emotional safety, how connection is not a game to you but a commitment. And they built themselves around that knowledge. They became exactly what you thought you were looking for. Not accidentally, but deliberately. Their interests aligned too perfectly. Their words landed too precisely. Their timing felt almost supernatural. They mirrored your values, validated your pain, reflected your depth back to you in ways that felt intoxicating. It wasn't because they understood you. It was because they had studied you. What felt like chemistry was choreography. What felt like fate was fabrication. Every gesture was calculated. Every moment of vulnerability was rehearsed. Every bond was manufactured layer by layer, designed to lower your defenses and invite you to open places within yourself that are sacred. They spoke of connection as if they respected it, while quietly attempting to anchor themselves into your energy. They wanted access not just to your heart, but to your essence. To the part of you that heals, that inspires, that anchors others without effort. Behind the scenes, they escalated when patience failed. They tried love spells when charm wasn't enough. Energy manipulation when words lost power. Karmic traps designed to create artificial ties through shared experiences, emotional highs, and manufactured crisis. They attempted to confuse intensity with destiny, attachment with purpose, obsession with alignment. They wanted you emotionally bonded so deeply that separation would feel like loss of self. But none of it worked. Something within you resisted in ways you couldn't fully explain. Even when you felt drawn, something stayed anchored. Even when emotions surged, something remained clear. You didn't lose yourself. You didn't collapse into dependency. You didn't hand over your sovereignty. Their rituals failed because they met a protection they couldn't penetrate. Your energy didn't respond the way it was supposed to. Your spirit didn't latch the way they expected. The cords they tried to attach dissolved as fast as they were formed. Your protection was stronger than their practices. Not because you were trying to block them, but because your alignment made you inaccessible to manipulation at the deepest level. What they mistook for hesitation was discernment. What they read as emotional complexity was spiritual clarity. They couldn't bind what was never available for ownership. That failure sent shockwaves through the entire operation. The seducer had promised results. The plan depended on your emotional capture. When you remained free, when you pulled back instead of entangling, the structure began to fracture. Pressure increased. Blame surfaced. Tension grew behind closed doors. Their inability to control you exposed the fragility of the system they were part of. Your resistance didn't just protect you. It disrupted everything. The illusion of control cracked. The confidence of the manipulators wavered. And the moment they realized you could not be bound was the moment their operation began to collapse from the inside out. The third figure wore innocence so convincingly that even you doubted yourself for noticing the discomfort. They wrapped themselves in concern, in softness, in the language of friendship and care. They spoke gently. They listened attentively. They positioned themselves as safe, as neutral, as someone who only wanted peace and understanding. On the surface, they appeared harmless, even supportive. But behind closed doors, their role was precise and deliberate. They were gathering intelligence, collecting fragments of your life, your words, your reactions, not to protect you, but to distort you. They moved through your social circles like a silent infection, never loud, never obvious, never aggressive. They didn't attack directly. They whispered. They hinted. They asked questions that sounded like concern but carried venom beneath them. They shared worries about you. They framed doubt as care. They planted narratives carefully enough that no single conversation sounded malicious, but together they formed a pattern of poison. By the time you sensed something was wrong, the air around you already felt different. They specialized in gaslighting with precision. Rewriting history so subtly that you questioned your own recollection. Changing the tone of past events, altering intentions, reshaping context until you no longer trusted your memory. They spoke with such certainty that you began replaying moments in your head, wondering if you misunderstood, if you overreacted, if you imagined things that never happened. They made you second-guess instincts that had guided you your entire life. They planted doubt where clarity once lived. They blurred lines you had drawn for your own safety. They framed your boundaries as flaws, your discernment as paranoia, your awareness as instability. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they made you question your intuition, then your judgment, then your sanity. The more confused you became, the more authority they claimed over the narrative. The less you trusted yourself, the more you leaned on their version of reality. Their most dangerous skill was not the lies themselves, but the way they made you feel responsible for the damage those lies caused. They made you feel like you were the problem. Like relationships fell apart because of you. Like tension followed you because of your personality. Like misunderstandings existed because you were difficult, emotional, or untrusting. They convinced you that if you just explained yourself better, adjusted yourself more, silenced yourself longer, things would improve. But lies rot. They decay from the inside, no matter how carefully they're constructed. And rot has a scent that eventually reaches everyone. Stories that don't align begin to sour. Narratives that require constant maintenance start to collapse under their own weight. People notice contradictions. Timelines stop matching. The concern they once believed begins to feel performative, rehearsed, hollow. What was once subtle becomes obvious. What was once dismissed as intuition becomes confirmed pattern. The infection that moved quietly is finally detected, and once seen, it cannot be unseen. The same mouth that spoke concern is remembered for spreading doubt. The same presence that claimed neutrality is recognized for quiet destruction. The innocence they wore begins to peel away, revealing manipulation underneath. You were never losing your mind. You were being disoriented on purpose. And now, as the lies begin to decompose in the open air, the truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to exist. Because rot always exposes itself. And once it does, nothing built on it can stand. Here is where everything changed, not with confrontation or exposure, but with awareness forming quietly in the background. Someone they dismissed without a second thought. Someone they overlooked because they didn't fit the profile of a threat. Someone they assumed was too passive, too simple, too irrelevant to matter. They treated this person as invisible, as background noise, as furniture in the room while plans were spoken aloud and intentions slipped through careless confidence. What they never realized was that invisibility can be the most powerful position of all. This person was watching. Not intrusively, not suspiciously, but attentively. Listening without interrupting. Observing without reacting. Connecting dots without announcing conclusions. They noticed shifts in tone, contradictions in stories, patterns in behavior that repeated too often to be coincidence. They remembered details others forgot. They paid attention when people assumed no one was paying attention at all. It may have been a family member, someone bound to you by blood or by a history deeper than convenience. It may have been a quiet observer, someone who rarely spoke but absorbed everything. A soul guided not by ambition or fear, but by a moral compass that refused to spin no matter how much pressure surrounded it. This person didn't need to be brilliant or powerful. They only needed to be honest. And they were. They overheard conversations that were never meant to leave the room. Conversations spoken with arrogance, with certainty, with the assumption of safety. They witnessed planning disguised as casual talk, jokes laced with intent, remarks that revealed far more than intended. They noticed how your name came up repeatedly, always followed by manipulation, strategy, or dismissal. They saw how stories shifted depending on the audience. They saw how concern was performed and how cruelty surfaced when masks slipped. At first, they struggled with what they were seeing. The weight of it didn't settle easily. Accepting the truth meant accepting that people they knew, people they trusted, people they once respected, were capable of deliberate harm. They questioned their own interpretation. They wondered if they were misunderstanding, exaggerating, projecting. But the patterns didn't stop. The evidence didn't fade. It accumulated. Moment by moment, the picture sharpened until denial was no longer possible. What once felt uncomfortable became undeniable. This was not miscommunication. This was not coincidence. This was not personality conflict. This was orchestration. And once that realization took hold, a decision stood directly in front of them. Silence or truth? Silence would have been easier. Silence would have preserved comfort, relationships, safety. Silence would have allowed them to remain untouched by backlash, unchallenged by consequences, unseen by those who don't forgive exposure. Silence would have meant stepping back and letting the damage continue, letting you carry the weight alone, letting the story end the way it was designed to end. But silence would have made them complicit. So they chose truth. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But decisively. They began documenting. Remembering. Preserving details instead of dismissing them. They stopped brushing off what they saw and started honoring what they knew. They aligned themselves not with power, not with influence, not with fear, but with what was right. That choice shifted everything. The moment truth was chosen over comfort, the operation lost its invisibility. The moment conscience overruled loyalty to the wrong people, protection activated in ways no one could reverse. What they thought was hidden now had a witness. What they assumed would dissolve into silence was anchored in memory. And from that point forward, the outcome was no longer theirs to control. They underestimated the quiet ones. They always do, but there was another presence moving far beyond what you could see, hidden deeper than gossip, further than social circles, operating in shadows where patience and precision live. An investigator. Not someone impulsive or emotional, not someone driven by revenge or spectacle, but someone disciplined, relentless, and unafraid of darkness. While others reacted, this person observed. While stories were spun, this person documented. While harm was dismissed as coincidence, this person recognized a pattern forming over years, not weeks. This investigator had been tracking predators like the ones who targeted you long before your name ever entered their files. Chosen ones marked for their gifts. Souls with influence that couldn't be controlled. Individuals whose presence disrupted fragile systems built on manipulation and secrecy. They had seen how light was siphoned, how confidence was eroded, how lives were slowly dismantled until the victim disappeared from relevance, credibility, or existence altogether. They had studied the aftermath, the silence left behind, the way society moved on without ever questioning what was lost. This wasn't one case. It was never just one. It was a repeating structure with familiar signatures. The same methods dressed in different faces. The same emotional traps. The same psychological warfare. The same financial exploitation. The same slow suffocation of truth. The investigator recognized it because they had seen it too many times to dismiss it as random. They understood that what looks isolated from the outside often reveals itself as systemic when viewed from above. They gathered recordings that were never meant to exist. Conversations spoken carelessly by people convinced of their immunity. Voices that revealed intent when they thought no one was listening. They traced financial trails that didn't align with official narratives, money moving quietly, resources exchanged in ways that pointed to coordination rather than coincidence. They collected witness statements from people who had been dismissed, silenced, or discredited, aligning timelines until the same names and methods appeared again and again. They documented victim histories, not as abstract stories, but as lived experiences with consequences. Patterns of isolation. Sudden reputational damage. Emotional destabilization. Loss of support. Loss of opportunity. Loss of self. Some survived, but never fully recovered. Others vanished into obscurity. Some never lived long enough to tell their story at all. The investigator understood that harm doesn't have to leave bruises to be lethal. Destruction can be psychological, spiritual, financial, and still end lives just as effectively. This wasn't attempted harm. This wasn't misunderstanding or miscommunication. These were successful crimes. Covered up with charm. Repeated with confidence. Systematic in design and execution. Each case reinforced the next. Each success emboldened the perpetrators. They believed they had perfected a formula that would never be challenged, a cycle that would continue because no one was patient enough to see the whole picture. But patience was exactly what this investigator possessed. They didn't rush exposure. They let arrogance do its work. They let the predators grow careless. They allowed the network to expand, knowing that expansion creates traces, and traces create vulnerability. While you were being protected in ways you didn't yet understand, this investigator was building something far more dangerous to your enemies than confrontation. They were building a case that could not be erased. Every file added weight. Every connection tightened the net. Every repeated pattern stripped away plausible deniability. By the time pressure began to surface, by the time fear crept into conversations behind closed doors, it was already too late. What had been hidden for years was now mapped in detail. What had been dismissed as isolated was now undeniable. What had been spiritual predation was now legally actionable. You were never alone in this, even when it felt that way. Forces were aligning across levels you couldn't access, preparing an outcome that didn't depend on your voice or your defense. Justice was being assembled quietly, methodically, without emotion clouding its accuracy. And once that machinery began to move, there was no stopping it. Chosen one, the truth is surfacing now, not in fragments, not in rumors, but in undeniable form. What once lived only in intuition is being translated into evidence. What once felt like a private knowing is now being echoed by voices outside of you. Records are aligning. Timelines are converging. Witnesses who stayed quiet out of fear, confusion, or loyalty are finding their courage. What was scattered is being assembled with precision. What was denied is being acknowledged without hesitation. The ground beneath the lies is no longer stable. What was done in secret is being judged in the open. Not whispered about. Not debated endlessly. Judged. Examined under light that exposes intent, pattern, and consequence. The masks that once protected wrongdoing are failing because they were never meant to withstand scrutiny. The same secrecy that empowered harm has now become its greatest liability. Silence is no longer shielding anyone. It is indicting them. Justice is not symbolic anymore. This is not about spiritual satisfaction or emotional closure alone. This is not about karma unfolding in invisible ways that only the soul can measure. This is legal. This is physical. This is structured consequence moving through systems designed to respond when truth is undeniable. Paper trails matter now. Statements matter now. Actions taken long ago are being re-examined through a lens that no longer looks away. The weight of what was done has crossed a threshold where it must be answered for in the material world. Someone is going to prison. Not because you demanded it. Not because you exposed anyone publicly. but because harm leaves fingerprints, and fingerprints accumulate. Because patterns tell stories no lie can erase. Because systems built on exploitation eventually collapse under their own repetition. Accountability is arriving not as revenge, but as correction. Balance is being restored through means that cannot be negotiated or delayed. And you? You rise. Not loudly. Not aggressively. You rise steadily, with clarity, with your integrity intact. You are protected in ways that are now obvious in hindsight. What tried to attach to you has been removed. What tried to define you has been overturned. What tried to silence you has lost relevance. Vindication is not something you chase anymore. It meets you where you stand. You are untouchable now, not because nothing can ever challenge you again, but because nothing that comes against you can take root. You see too clearly. You are too anchored. You are too aligned to be destabilized by the same tactics twice. The cycle that targeted you has been broken at its source. Stay grounded. Not reactive. Not intoxicated by outcome. Grounded. Stay silent where silence preserves your peace and speaks louder than defense ever could. Stay aligned with what carried you through confusion, isolation, and pressure without turning you bitter or cruel. Alignment is your protection. It always has been. The universe is handling the rest. You don't need to monitor the collapse. You don't need to wait for updates. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. What is moving now is larger than emotion and stronger than resistance. Your only responsibility is to continue forward without dragging the weight of what tried to destroy you into the life that is opening in front of you. This chapter is closing not with noise, but with finality. And you are still standing, exactly where you were meant to be, ready for what comes next. But their biggest mistake was never tactical or intellectual. It was spiritual. They underestimated the forces protecting you because they judged protection by what they could see, measure, or manipulate. They assumed power only existed where it announced itself. They assumed silence meant absence. They assumed restraint meant vulnerability. And in doing so, they crossed a threshold they were never meant to cross. The moment they reached too far into your life, something ancient stirred. Not summoned, not requested, not forced into motion, but awakened. Guardians that do not rush, that do not warn, that do not negotiate. Forces tied not to ego or personality, but to lineage. To covenant. To bloodlines that have survived erasure, persecution, and extinction attempts across generations. What stood up for you was not random energy. It was inheritance. Bloodline protectors stepped forward, the kind that activate only when the threat is existential. The kind that recognize when one of their own is being targeted not for behavior, but for essence. Ancestral forces that have watched quietly through centuries, waiting for moments where balance must be enforced. You didn't feel them arrive with noise or spectacle. You felt them as containment. As interruption. As things failing that were never supposed to fail. From that moment on, the rules changed. Their spiritual sight was stripped away as consequence, not punishment. The ability they relied on to read energy, to sense advantage, to predict outcomes, was removed. Not dulled. Not blocked temporarily. Removed. They became blind in the realm they once navigated with confidence. Signals they once interpreted effortlessly went silent. Intuition they trusted betrayed them. What once felt like clarity turned into static. They lost discernment. Could no longer tell friend from threat. Opportunity from trap. Safe move from fatal error. The protection they thought they carried evaporated without warning. Doors they expected to open closed abruptly. Allies they trusted turned unpredictable. They were left operating in a reality they no longer understood, reacting instead of controlling, guessing instead of calculating. In trying to steal your gifts, they lost their own. The insight they once flaunted dried up. The influence they once commanded weakened. The confidence that came from feeling spiritually superior collapsed into paranoia. They could no longer draw from the same source because that source no longer recognized them. Power taken without consent always comes with a debt. And the debt came due all at once. In trying to bind you, they bound themselves. The traps they set became the structures they were caught in. The manipulation they perfected turned inward. The webs they spun tightened around their own movement. They became stuck replaying the same thoughts, the same fears, the same miscalculations, unable to move forward because the very tactics they used to immobilize others were now immobilizing them. In trying to control your destiny, they surrendered theirs. The future they planned evaporated. The timelines they depended on collapsed. What they thought was inevitable unraveled faster than they could adapt. They no longer shaped outcomes. They reacted to consequences. They no longer dictated terms. They answered to them. You didn't have to retaliate. You didn't have to expose them yourself. You didn't have to understand the mechanics of what was happening. Protection doesn't require your awareness to function. It only requires alignment. And you stayed aligned even when it cost you comfort, clarity, and companionship. What moved on your behalf did so with precision. No excess. No chaos. Only correction. They will never fully understand what went wrong. And that is part of the judgment. Because when spiritual sight is stripped, explanation disappears with it. They are left only with outcomes they cannot rationalize, losses they cannot reverse. And a sense of powerlessness they never believed they would experience. You, meanwhile, remain intact. Not untouched by the experience, but unbroken by it. Still sovereign. Still protected. Still moving forward with what was always yours. They thought you were alone. They were wrong, chosen one. The truth is surfacing now with a force that cannot be redirected or delayed. What once existed as whispers, as fragments, as uneasy feelings you carried alone, is being assembled into something solid and undeniable. Evidence is stacking in layers, each piece reinforcing the next. Documents align. Timelines lock into place. Witnesses who once hesitated are speaking clearly, no longer willing to carry the weight of silence. What was hidden in shadows is being pulled into full view, not by emotion, but by fact. What was done in secret is being judged in the open. Not reinterpreted. Not excused. Judged. Actions are being examined for what they were, not for how they were framed. Intent is being exposed where performance once lived. The same secrecy that allowed harm to continue is now dismantling the very people who relied on it. There is no place left to hide where truth has decided to stand. Justice is no longer symbolic. This is not a spiritual lesson alone. This is not closure that only you feel inside. This is legal. This is physical. This is consequence moving through systems designed to respond when deception becomes provable. Procedures are being followed. Charges are being considered. Accountability is forming shape. This is inevitable because the threshold has already been crossed, and once it is crossed, there is no reversal. Someone is going to prison. Not because of vengeance. Not because of exposure driven by emotion. But because patterns leave trails, and trails lead to answers. Because what was repeated for too long created a record that could not be erased. Because harm multiplied until it demanded response. This is correction, not chaos.